I am super excited to welcome my next guest to the show today. This is a new guest appearing with me for the first time, author Robert Tanenbaum. Robert, welcome to the show. How are you?
Thank you. Very good. Good to be with you.
I'm excited. You've got a new book coming out in just a couple of days. It's called That Day in Dallas, and it's going to explain to us that Lee Harvey Oswald did not kill JFK. And of course, I agree with you, but I'm very interested to hear about your insights and everything that's going to come out in this new book.
Well, it is. I mean, to the extent that the evidence, the overwhelming evidence, will come out. And the only real question I ever had was when Richard Sprague, who was the chief assistant DA in Philadelphia, called me. I didn't know who he was. He was an extraordinary person, particularly in the state of Pennsylvania, if not nationwide. Anyone had a serious case in Pennsylvania, they went to see Dick Sprague in Philly. And he spent his lifetime basically in this, as chief assistant, a good measure of it, I should say. Uh, and he was an extraordinarily brilliant lawyer, and at the same time, he was his integrity was second to none. And the reason I mention that is in this case, when he was appointed, he was appointed in March of October rather of '76. He was appointed chief counsel to the House Select Committee on Assassinations involving Martin Luther King as well as President Kennedy. He called me and asked me if I would go to Washington with him. I had no idea what was going on with respect to the House Select Committee. I was very much involved in dealing with the DA's office work I had, and that was 10 years of being in charge of the Homicide Bureau and the criminal courts. And so I had plenty to do. And we had 250 new cases every day in the criminal courts from morning 150 cases and another at night, 7 days a week, 100. And my job was to make sure we got some quality dispositions here, not just plea bargain everything away, which too many DAs like doing, and then claim to people like the New York Times they got great statistics to show felony dispositions on cases that are horrendous, and that should be no less a plea. And that's why I instituted a bunch of cases, however many they were, would have no lesser plea attached to them, leaving the defendants the right, of course, always to plea bargain, or rather just to plea to the top count of any indictment, and then argue in mitigation on sentence, and and of course the prosecution argues in aggravation. So that that issue occurred when, to me, when Sprague said he was just designated chief counsel to the House Select Committee on Assassinations, and that he was staff director. He wanted me to go to Washington with him starting in January of '77, because as you know, a select committee only has a 2-year life. Well, the standing committees have in perpetuity because they're just getting to continue to get refunded. So we went to Washington, and in Washington, a very interesting thing occurred with respect to all this, and that is uh, Senator Schweiker, Senator Richard Schweiker called me and asked me to visit with him in Washington because he had just had the Senate subcommittee investigation into the assassinations and the executive committee's responses to these assassinations. That is, in every department, they're, they have their own intel office. So, of course, there's tremendous duplication and unnecessary duplication. But, of course, the main one was CIA. And he said he wanted me to have his notes and that he was heartbroken to tell me the second portion of what his investigation revealed in his judgment. And that was that an agency of our government, the CIA, participated in the assassination of President Kennedy. And that was I spent 10 years in the DA's office, and the major DA's office in the country, and trying more cases than anyone other than Dick Sprague, interestingly. That is to prosecute successfully after verdict, not to call a juror in and say, okay, we now have a jury, and then the defendant would plead guilty kind of thing. And people count those kinds of cases as part of their trial strategies. But of course, it's meaningless with respect to trying cases, 2 verdicts successfully. And Sprague is the only person who has actually ever tried more than I. And he is a very, very unique person, as I mentioned, brilliant and integrity beyond the call. So we go to Washington, and we ran into interesting things that occurred pretty much close to what Schweiker had told me. And that was in large measure that, and here's the proof for it, the large measure that our government knowingly contrived a predetermined conclusion by way of a pretense full investigation. And right. and both the Warren Commission and the House Select Committee on Assassinations intentionally disregarded evidence that not only was exculpatory with respect to Lee Harvey Oswald, but it demonstrated beyond doubt that he could not and did not kill the president. And when I tell you this, I don't want to just say it was to simplify things, but what Sprague and I did for 7 days a week, without any clock telling us what to do or not to do, was to do an investigation just as we would if we were investigating a murder case. And we were both amazed at the evidence. It was all there. And how more people who were very good people were going through the process of an inspiring process of spending a tremendous amount of time and not wanting to do something that is very important from an evidentiary point of view, not an opinion point of view. Sort of always amazed me. They're interested in their own little area. Well, were 2 coffins used? Was there surgery done in JFK? All this stuff. What does that have to do with what happened at Dealey Plaza?
And let me ask you this, Robert, if I may. When the assassination first occurred, because when you're talking about the Select Committee, that's years later, 1975 or something like that, right?
77. 77. The late 76 to start in January of 77.
Right. So when the assassination occurred in 1963, first of all, obviously everybody wants to know, where were you? And what was your initial impression? Did you believe what they said on the news, that Lee Harvey Oswald had shot? Was this like a revelation to you when you became involved in the Select Committee? When did you first realize that they had been lying about everything to do with Lee Harvey Oswald?
I never got involved in the Select Committee until Sprague called me, as I mentioned, in October of 76. And he told me all about what he expected to do as a result of being named staff director and chief counsel. And he wanted me to be head of the subcommittee investigating the assassination of President Kennedy, and which I accepted. And we went to Washington. But in 1963, I was a college student at the University of California at Berkeley. I grew up in Brooklyn, and on an athletic scholarship, basketball, I went to the University of California at Berkeley in 1961, and I went to law school there as well. I met Martin Luther King there. I see his photo up right now.
Wow.
I met Martin Luther King because I was in charge. I was a class president, and I was in charge basically of getting speakers to come to Berkeley, and one of whom, of course, we all thought would be the greatest one to get was Dr. Martin Luther King, and indeed he was.
That's amazing.
Extraordinary person, obviously. It's hard to believe that at the age of 39 he was murdered and taken from us. Just another heartbreaking story. But as far as the assassination went, it was heartbreaking because of the affection we had for President Kennedy. I mean, this was Camelot in a very real sense, and that we would have procedures in place that were authorized by the Constitution and by common sense and fairness. And that's what was so unique about what happened at that time. But again, then when I finished law school in 68, I wound up going to the DA's office in Manhattan. And that was deemed to be the place to go if you were interested in having any kind of background in law enforcement and learning about the way law enforcement ought to work in all cases, not just any kind of dual system at all. And there were like several hundred applications, which I never ever knew about, for students like myself, who wanted to go to the DA's office in Manhattan for legendary DA Frank Hogan. He was the DA in the DA's office from 35 to 74. And he actually became the head DA. He worked for Tom Dewey, Mr. Republican. Hogan always had Republican, Democrat, liberal, conservative support for all those years that he was running. He was running the office as DA, and he became the DA in 42 when Dewey became governor. And then, of course, Dewey had a meteoric career as governor, and then, of course, he ran for president in 44 and 48. Most people only remember the 48 election against Harry Truman. But it was a fabulous, place to be because it was totally apolitical. And Hogan never wavered from that. And there's a book I did at the request of one of my mentors, Echoes of My Soul. And it's the case that ultimately we had Miranda come down with. And that's the kind of office we were in. And I urge you to take a good look at Echoes of My Soul. I'm not here. I'm supposed to be selling it that day in Dallas, but forgive me for being open-ended here. And Echoes of My Soul was an indication, if you wanted to know what a DA's office was doing and should do. Echoes of My Soul is your book. Now, my book, that was my book, obviously. I was asked by my mentor to do it, and it was a labor of love. And that day in Dallas, which I'm now out with your good grace, trying to tell people to read, because it is the finest book I've done. And that is to say, I've had published 29 novels, which were the Marlene Champy Carp series of a family. They meet together as assistant DAs. She initially, Marlene Champy is head of the sex crimes unit, and he becomes an assistant DA, and he is the DA, then becomes DA, and they have a family. So I modeled it after my own family. But then there were five nonfiction books. The fifth is That Day in Dallas. The official pub date is June 10th. But that doesn't preclude people from actually going out there right now and making sure that there's an adjustment made with respect to Amazon and Barnes and Noble. But in any event, meaningful stuff. I do hope that the book does, that you do get a hold of the book, because in the book I explain how I obtained my own value system, which I tell through anecdotal detail and reveal things I've never ever spoken to about. But I thought the time had come, and the reason the time had come for me, because people say, well, why do you wait so long, kind of thing. And a good part of it had to do with, I wound up with a cancer situation, a number 4, and a tumor.
Oh, sorry to hear that.
So I was put out of commission, as you can imagine, for a while. And I went through the chemo and the radiation, never thinking anything would change. So I didn't want to do the surgery because I thought everything I heard from the doctors, my doctors, was it would be a major change in my life with the surgery done, assuming it was done well. And I didn't want to do that for some obvious reasons about, a lifestyle to live. But I did take the radiation first, and then we did do the chemo. The chemo, I want to mention this because there's so many people in our country who suffer from this. My story is my story. I'm not telling anybody how to behave or what to do or how to relate to family. You'll know what to do, believe me. You have a good heart and you're a good person, you'll figure it out. But I was very, very, very concerned about now with my book, and I had started my book in 2017, 18, and so on. And I realized I wasn't being honest with the whole story. So I started anew, fresh. And then I got a telephone call. I had no expectation, by the way, anything would happen other than I had about a year to go, they told me, without the surgery. And then my doctor called me in, and David Hoffman, the person in charge of CEDAR is here in LA. And the chemo person who refused to give me the chemo until the radiation wore off, he said, "You're still cooking." I said, "What do you want to do? Put me in tinfoil here?" Like
You look very well, by the way, so thank goodness you're all right, it seems.
Yeah, well, I tell you, I am here, thank God, but it's an act of grace, because he called me into the office. We were going to do 12 sessions, which are 2 sessions a month when you get this situation working. And he said, "Do you believe in miracles?" We had just finished 6. So we started in June, and now we were in August. And he said, "You believe in miracles?" I said, "No, I'm a Yankee fan. I'm not a Mets fan." And never lose your sense of humor about your life. If you do, it gets worse.
Yeah.
And he said, "The entire tumor is evaporated."
It's amazing. Congratulations on beating that.
Go figure. If I can't sit here and tell you I did A, B, and C, and therefore everybody should do it. It was a miracle. He was right. It was a miracle, because I had no expectation it would happen ever. I just was going through the motions, if you will, because I didn't want my family, since I wouldn't do the surgery, I didn't want my family to think I'm just walking out on, hey, goodbye, that's the end of that routine.
Right.
When I went to see my doctors on various occasions, rooms were filled with people suffering from this dread disease. And they even told me that when they give chemo, that 50% of the people don't even need it, because the good cells are hiding behind the bad cells are hiding behind the good cells, kind of thing. And that, there's no guarantee about anything down the road. It's just a situation that occurs, and that's why it has to be watched so carefully.
Yeah.
So if I urge anyone to do anything, is to make sure you go have your exams, which are nothing compared to what the anxiety level is when you don't do it, and you have a serious thing occurring to your body. I mean, it doesn't become a secret down the line.
You've really had quite an amazing life, though. I mean, forgive me for having not heard about you relative to the JFK assassination prior, but I mean, you were involved. The foreword of your book is written by Robert Groden, who I guess I would presume you met him during the select committee. He was in charge of the photo evidence, as I understand it.
He is, to this day, he's shocked that finally he's being recognized. When I always include Robert Groden whenever I see him, if ever I'm giving a speech and asked to someone, I go out of my way when he's in the audience to say the kind of commitment he's made to truth is extraordinary. And that's why I agreed with my publisher that his comment and description of me, which is very short, a page or 2, that it should be special. It is special. And it became the foreword of the book. So he's finally getting some recognition that he's earned. He deserves it.
Yeah.
And I'm very delighted about it, believe me.
For people who haven't heard of him, he is the individual who obtained the Zapruder film and duplicated it and gave it to Geraldo Rivera, where it was played for the first time to the public in 1975 on maybe, what's it called, Good Night America, or some Geraldo Rivera show. But that was Robert Groden. We would probably have never seen the Zapruder film if it wasn't for Robert. Isn't that true?
Not only that, but his courage is second to none. And that he has had some documents, etc., all kinds of things that are verified as true. But the government is another way of handling the truth, particularly in this case. And it's despicable what they do when they try to defame people and destroy their reputations. And, Mark Lane went through this. And Mark and I have always had different political philosophies irrelevant to our friendship. Because I've always believed him to be a person as a truth seeker. And I never thought of that until I really got to know him. And I found him to be a truth seeker, that a lot of the publicity and the things he did that carried a different persuasion, legitimately, because he was a very outspoken guy, and he was, in his own way, he was very courageous. So, I mean, there's so much that you get when you're involved in these kinds of situations. And uh, one of the most hot, probably one of the hottest pieces of evidence in the case, people like Gordon I got for me, and that was during the investigation. I'll give you an example of this. It's somewhat shocking to me, but I want your opinion on it. And I see Gordon right now, but God bless him. Anyway, it's a letter written by, not a letter, but a document written by John McCone, who became head of the CIA when JFK fired Allen Dulles, because Dulles had totally misled the president, so he felt, with respect to the Bay of Pigs invasion.
Right.
And Allen Dulles, I don't have to tell you, was totally connected. His brother John Dulles, Secretary of State, and these were very serious characters in the process of what goes on or what went on in our government. And in any event, the work that was done gave us this document. And he McCone had was responding. I'm taking the time to do this because I really want you to hear this piece of evidence. McCone was responding to James Rowley's concern. He was then Chief of Secret Service, James Rowley. And Rowley was concerned, as McCone was concerned, about leaks. Why? Because they were committed to making sure, whatever they could do, they didn't want the American public to know that Lee Harvey Oswald was a contract employee of the CIA and the FBI, and that he was, in 1957, he was working at Atsugi Air Force Base in Japan, monitoring the U-2 flights, those intel flights. And one was shot down, and Gary Powers was the pilot.
Right. Yeah.
And Angleton, who was our head super spy, he used Oswald because he believed, among other things, that Oswald was very much involved in serving the country, and that was what the story was at the time. And then, of course, everything shifted when J. Edgar Hoover said he knew exactly what happened within about a few weeks. It was Oswald. He did it alone. 3 shots were fired from the rear. We'll get to that, the absurdity of that, an insult to one's intelligence. But back to McCone. So McCone gets the job in 1961 when Allen Dulles is fired by JFK. And let me just finish off on this, because it's incredible when you have good human beings involved and they make mistakes because they're human. JFK told Bobby, his brother, Bobby Kennedy, then Attorney General of the United States, he said to him, this whole Bay of Pigs thing is a fiasco. I didn't know all the details, but they gave it to Nixon because he was the vice president, and everybody who knew anything, according to them, the insiders, that Nixon would be president in 1960. Everybody knew JFK had no chance of winning. Of course, it didn't turn out that way, thank God. And so they were very much involved in handling another matter. He told his brother. He said, "It's not over yet, this Bay of Pigs thing." And Bobby said, "What do you mean?" He said, "Nixon agreed to having air support." And Bobby said, "You mean bombing Cuba?" He said, "Yes." He said, "Well, I'm going to tell you something. They were in a room now alone for very high sources." And Bobby said, "Jack, you're not going to bomb Cuba. If you do, it'll be no different from the Japanese bombing of Pearl Harbor. And it'll ruin your life. And of course, it'll ruin your legacy. You're not going to do it." They stared at each other, I was told. JFK didn't take his eyes off his brother, who didn't take his eyes off him. They hugged each other, and he said, "Thank you. There'll be no bombing of Cuba." To this day, the Cuban people, that is to say, the people who were involved in this invasion that never worked out the way it was supposed to work out, That is, the Cubans were not on the beaches there hugging Americans who were coming in. You can imagine what would have happened if he ever bombed Cuba. And JFK, because of the person he was, and that's what's so important about values. I'm going to bounce right into that one for you. It seems to me the people we want in high office are people who have our values. All kinds of stress will occur that is unforeseen, and you better have someone who can handle this kind of situation. So that gets me back to the John McCone letter, document. And in it, he responds to Rowley's concern about leaks. And it's a 2-page letter. And I'll get to paragraph 6 of page 2. The third page is a signature sheet. And so McCone writes in his document of March 3rd, 64. He writes in this document that there were too many leaks going on about Lee Harvey Oswald, his training, his suspect activity, and Truman had done a document on December 22, 63, and Truman said that one of the worst things he ever did was permit the Office of Strategic Services to morph into the CIA.
Right.
Why? Because the CIA was operational. It became operational, and it was forming policy, and they had no authority to do that, and they were creating embarrassment for the country. Now comes the McCone document. Now he's head of the CIA. As I said, Allen Dulles fired in 61. And McCone says he's concerned that if any of the disclosed material goes into the wrong person's hands, he said, it would lead the media to erroneously claim that this agency, the CIA, and perhaps others were directly involved in the Dallas action. They refer to the assassination as the Dallas action. And then he says, mind-bendingly to me, someone coming out of the DA's office, someone who went to PS 238 in Brooklyn, while the persons involved in the assassination of our president were in the employ of the CIA, as well as the FBI, he says it becomes impossible for us to monitor everything they're doing. And that was his explanation for it. Wow. Now, I tell you that this document is so extraordinary, and it took such great courage to come up with it, because the government immediately said it's a fake. It's no fake. This was found in 78 in the archives. It was republished. It was republished by Russell. It was republished by Dick Russell, who's the author of 3 books on the Kennedy assassination, a very well-respected person, I'm sure you know.
Yep.
And he referred to that in The Man Who Knew Too Much, his book of 91. So this was not an issue here of authenticity. This was an issue of incredible outrage, it seems to me, and it has always seemed to me. It's not just us chatting today, which I appreciate, but it's the kind of thing that just say, what is next? When are we going to get hold of our government?
Well, that's what I wanted to ask you, because this is now, we're talking about maybe the pivotal event for most people that I think today far more people recognize that the government is dishonest. In 1963, I guess a lot of people thought if the government says Lee Harvey Oswald did it, it must be true. But what do you think now with the Donald Trump assassination attempt and all the things? It almost seems like everything we hear from the government is a lie, doesn't it?
Well, I would say this, and it breaks my heart to say this. My values are somewhere between Jefferson and Washington and Lincoln. There's no secret. I make no secret about that. All of my books are apolitical. I don't get involved in the politics of my books, but my values are conservative, obviously. But I have to say, based upon all the things I've researched and the books I've written, this is the worst government with respect to sincerity and honesty, I believe, in American history. Not only do we have the issues that we're dealing with in the whole Biden fiasco, but What about the money they took? I'm still waiting to hear what the secretary in Moscow had $3.5 million allegedly to give to him. What about the hundreds of millions of dollars involved in this unconscionable stuff that Elon Musk, thank God for Elon Musk. After all, what are people saying? He's taking the job, he needs the money. I'd like to know what his interest payments are a year, a month. And he spends all this time to be vilified. And why? The disclosures are extraordinary. And one of the disclosures they still haven't really hit yet is that all of the money, when you look at the contents of where this money was allegedly going, shocking where it was going, absurd things. But the money never ever went there. That's how Biden has 3 houses on the beach in his home state. These are people who never worked a day in their life in the private sector. They never had to meet payments. They never had to pay those taxes about employees and the rest of it that goes there. And yet he gets vilified for doing a tremendous service to our country. I don't think he can be thanked enough for doing what he's done. And so when you ask me what's going on with our government, in my history majoring and all that in college and so on, and all this, the work I've done with the government, 10 years, as I said, in the DA's office in Manhattan, and I only did it because I knew he was a legendary DA. It's painful. We can't believe the thing this government tells us is the bottom line. That's what the bottom line is here.
Sorry to interrupt. Let me ask you about the Manhattan DA's office. There's another disgrace, of course, Alvin Bragg bringing these cases on completely novel legal theories that have basically proven to be false. And what did you think about that whole Stormy Daniels trial and everything?
Well, I mean, I'm sorry. I thought you were going to continue on. No, you know, as I've written and I've done this book, That Day in Dallas, and the flap indicates how I've done it and why I did it. And that is to say, I wanted the reader to know what it means to prosecute a case, particularly a case of this extraordinary magnitude, but that doesn't change things. There's no case that's not serious enough to be concerned about. And so I've come to the conclusion that what we have here is the government knowingly contrives a predetermined conclusion through the pretense of an investigation. Both the Warren Commission and the House Select Committee, as I said initially, disregarded the evidence in the case. And I don't know how those people who are running our government today ever can sleep one night. They're going to get caught eventually.
You're right.
Now,
it's
what's going
psychopathy,
on,
isn't it? They have to be crazy.
It's totally self-fulfilling, self-loathing. It must be. Why not do the right thing here? It's hard enough to do the right thing. Now, when you mention the DA's office now, it's not a DA's office. It's more the brothel of DA's offices, and they don't know they're DA's. And when I say I worked in the Manhattan DA's office, it's one of the proudest moments of my total public life. It was, again, incredible amount of applications. My family had no Jews. We were a middle-class family from Brooklyn. And I was just selected after interviews and going over my record at Berkeley and so on, that they wanted to see everything I had done. And they were extraordinary. There were 2 most extraordinary people there were, as I mentioned, echoes of my soul, Mel Glass, Assistant DA Mel Glass, and John Keenan, who was head of the Homicide Bureau. And he subsequently became a federal district court judge. But I was in his bureau before I became head of the Homicide Bureau. And same thing for Mel in the criminal courts. He became a judge himself, as an acting Supreme Court judge in New York. Mm-hmm. But I urge you to take a look at that book, Echoes of My Soul, as well as, That Day in Dallas, because it will tell you exactly what should happen. Not every result is one that is favorable. Believe me, it doesn't work that way. But what does work that way is if you do it all honestly and you have exculpatory evidence which you give over as soon as you can to the defense. And I'm talking from a prosecutor's point of view here, of course. And then you deal with the defense to indicate which cases are no lesser plea cases. They're too vital. They're too harmful. They're heinous. How people do this to other people is mind-boggling for openers. And so I said that we would create a no lesser plea situation of those cases that we're not going to plea bargain. And as I said initially, again, that doesn't mean that the defendant cannot plead guilty. He can plead guilty to the top count, every defendant to the top count of the indictment. And then he argues in mitigation. And then the prosecutor comes back in aggravation. And that's what this is all about. But it should be done professionally. It's not, I don't like that defense attorney, I'm going to get his client routine. I ever hear that. It drives me crazy. I have to run around the block.
Robert, let me ask you a question, because I think a lot of people might not realize this. Plea bargaining, it's become so common, but you're describing a career that goes back to a time when it really was uncommon. It's almost like an invention that became used, as you say, to increase like the batting average and the statistics of these offices, where today now it's been so distorted by people like Letitia James, who,
Absolutely.
According to this article here, is caught in a war of her own making. And, one thing I wanted to just share with you, because you and I have never spoken before today. Your book agent contacted me to arrange this interview, and I'm so glad that she did. You're a fascinating guy, and people are definitely going to want to read your book. But, I have no legal training whatsoever. Just from doing this show, I've been so assaulted by Lawfare that I've been forced to become my own pro se advocate. And I have recently discovered evidence in the case of, here I am attacking the court in Washington, D.C. I've got a constitutional motion that I'm waiting to hear from the judge on. It's a motion to declare forfeiture of judicial authority under Article 3, Section 1, where I'm informing the judge that he's in violation of Article 3's good behavior clause, and he needs to leave the case, leave the federal judiciary, and essentially leave the building immediately. But I've also discovered evidence that Letitia James, with her father, basically stole a woman's apartment through a corrupt probate. And it's interesting because this happened in 1983. And just in scanning the records in the surrogate's court, I found this judge, Cassandra A. Johnson. She was born in 1982 or 1983. She's only 43 years old today. And she was sworn in as a judge in January of 2025. But amazingly, it's this judge's name that appears on this petition for the probate filing. Here it is. We've got an administration petition from 1982. The decedent is someone named Marie Rose. She died in 1982, but yet Judge Cassandra Johnson's name is on the case, as if she's been looking at this or someone's been actively doing something with this case sometime since January 2025. It's quite strange. So there's been a corruption of the justice system. You're talking, see, people hear stuff like this and it's like, oh, everybody talks about the good old days, but it's not just that. You're talking about justice in this country for murders and murder of the President of the United States. It's astonishing, isn't it? We're living in a world of lies.
Well, it is astonishing. It's really breathtaking when you talk about this Letitia woman, and everything about her is wrong. I have to say that from what I've seen. No DA, no prosecutor, no one in this government of ours should be going after anyone. That's not what this is about. If someone has committed crime, the answer is, do we have the kind of immutable facts that cannot be repudiated? They cannot be in any way found to be not true. And that's how you try cases, with immutable facts. And they're corroborated as well. But you don't say, hey, I'm now a prosecutor and I'm going to get this guy Trump or anyone else. And I'll follow them. It's all about the money. That so delegitimizes public authority. It's devastating. And as far as plea bargaining goes, you hit it on the head. But what's happened is the amount of crime is extraordinary, and we get the wrong statistics all the time from these Letitia characters who make it up as they go. They don't tell us exactly, and we shouldn't rely upon what they're saying at all. What we need to do is make sure that we're getting the legitimate facts, and it better be from the FBI, which Obama et al. Has destroyed. They totally delegitimized the FBI, in my judgment, and they turned the great organization into some political thing that was a personal enjoyment to know that nothing could happen to them because they created a dual system of justice in America.
But wait a minute, isn't it true that during the JFK assassination, J. Edgar Hoover, he was pretty corrupt? He certainly helped cover it up, and there's those phone calls with LBJ.
Without question, you're absolutely right. The fact that there's a building named after him in our democracy in Washington, it's always been, as we say in Brooklyn, a shanda. It's a, how do you explain that to the children? You want to know what the facts were about what he didn't do, and the corruption he was involved in, and yet there's a building to honor him? No, I don't get it. I don't buy that. And you hit it on the head. There are so many things that have to be done, and it's one of the reasons why I was intent on completing my book, That Day in Dallas. It took me several years because of the whole cancer thing I wanted to mention, because people always say, well, why did you wait, blah, blah, blah. It's like I have some hidden agenda here. And I told them it's because I wanted to make sure that I got the truth out about all this, and that it was one way of dealing with a president, his family, people who care a lot about our country and who have made great sacrifices on behalf of our country, personal sacrifices. And that's why I decided that this was the right time to get involved and say what I had to say.
Yeah.
And that's why the anecdotal part of the book is so important. And then the evidentiary part of the book is overwhelming. And anyone who thinks otherwise, I'd like to know what your thoughts are, because it's all out there in the public. It's not anything that Sprague and I made up. We just shook our heads every night and said, what is going on here?
Well, let me ask you this, just as a follow-up here. Everybody obviously was very interested in this 2025 documents release. Have you been following this? Is there any new information that was released when Trump came into office relative to the JFK assassination?
The only thing that is surprising about any of this 80,000 stuff is Trump's expression, as he expressed to some people. He said, the reason why I didn't turn it all over, as I mentioned already, is that if you saw things I saw in those documents, you wouldn't have turned it over either. My feeling about all that is that's exactly the stuff the American people have to know. And it may be somewhat defamatory. And if it is, then you can always delete a defamatory portion of it in camera with a court. And if there's any leak with respect to national security, same story. It's not an out to say it's a national security, therefore we got to keep our mouths shut. Or the great one, this case is under investigation, we can't talk about it right now. But
right.
These Letitias will have press conferences right down the line about everything. That's wrong. So that's why it's so important to have people like yourself, with all due respect, believe me, I thank you for the opportunity to be here and be able to chat with you, because I hope that your audience understands the service you're doing, and it is a great service. You love it, I'm sure, and yet people like you make this thing work. Ultimately, I'm still an optimist. Trust me, it's not over by any stretch of the imagination, and we'll fight them on the beaches if we have to, routine, but we'll do that. We'll do everything we can in order to make sure we live the life that has independent meaning in making America America.
Well, thank you for those kind words, and I'm honored to have you with us. You're an historic figure with regard to all of this, and I think far too few people know about you. I just want to also share something with you that most people haven't seen. Maybe about 10 years ago, I went to the National Archives, And to give you a bit of my background, before I got into independent journalism and doing Crowdsource the Truth, I was a visual effects cinematographer in Hollywood, specialized in 3D, stereoscopic cameras and things like that. So in 2015, I went to the National Archives, and they had all these boxes and boxes of stuff that you could look through, and if you found things, you could bring it to this desk, and they would, decide if they could declassify it or not. And I found this photograph, which was from Ruth and Michael Payne's garage. It's a Dallas police or FBI photo of Lee Harvey Oswald's personal effects. He's got this hands-off Cuba flyer right here. A lot of it seems like maybe what the police would call an orgy of evidence, trying to frame Lee Harvey Oswald with certain things. This is where they found the picture of him in the backyard holding the rifle. But the thing that struck my attention was this 1950s era stereoscopic, stereo realist camera. And I didn't know this, but Lee Harvey Oswald was an avid 3D photographer. He's got 10 boxes of stereoscopic slides right here, Kodak stereo slides, and then he's got a box filled with monoscopic slides. At the time, they didn't know where these slides were or if I could access them. But I'm trying to get a hold of Lee Harvey Oswald's 3D photography, because who knows what these images might hold. Have you ever heard about that before, Lee Harvey Oswald taking 3D photos?
No, I haven't. And there's just such, if I mention to you what happened at Dealey Plaza for a moment, and I just take one portion of it, it'll show you the total absurdity of the government, what the government does. And believe me, you'll shake your head. Here we go, if I can. And that is, first of all, what's interesting about witnesses in a case is they think they're only valuable if they can say, I saw Joe Dokes, hypothetically, shoot the deceased, and I can make an identification. Okay. All wrong. Yes, that would be helpful if he was corroborated and it was trustworthy. But what happened in Dallas with the witnesses were, they claimed that the first flurry of shots had there were 2 or 3 shots. Now, I had the benefit of witness interviews, of scientific audiovisual evidence, acoustics, and the immutable facts that I'm referring to. And it was that the first flurry of shots had 3 shots. 3 shots. And I'm sorry, let me go back for a second. It had 3 shots that hit Kennedy and Governor Connolly. The Kennedy shot was in his back, like 5 or 6 inches below the neckline, and it was a downward track. Why is that important? Because when you get to the single bullet theory, that bullet has to come out JFK's throat. But it's impossible for it to happen when the initial from autopsy, we see it's 5, 6 inches below the neckline. And it's a downward track. How does it come up? And the government said, well, it came up 11 degrees and came out his throat. Came up 11 degrees. That's the same kind of thing they did here. And that is to say, when the witnesses said that the first flurry happened very quickly, they didn't know, but that took 2.6 seconds. They then said there was a pause. They didn't know how long. It was 4.8 seconds. And then there was a boom blast that came from the stockade fence area where Zapruder was filming. And in the boom blast, the people on the bridge, Holland, Mr. Holland, Skinny Holland, and his workers, at least 5 or 6 of them, were on the bridge watching the limo come down, going westbound on Elm. And the shot rang out, which was the 4th shot. There were 5 shots recorded by us, and not 3, as the government has asserted. But it's more pernicious than that. And when the reason is the following: the 4th shot caused a boom blast, which caused everyone who was around there to look over on their left-hand side to see what happened. And many saw the plume of smoke from the high-powered rifle shot. And in the area of close proximity to where Zapruder was filming, you can see it. It's to the right of him as he's filming, because he hears the shot come in. And there were people there who were in the line of fire, a whole bunch of people. Emmett Hudson, Bill and Gail Newman, their children, Lee Bowers, who worked for the government, and Joe Marshall Smith was a police officer who stops. Someone told him there were shots being fired in that area, which depicted right here on the grassy area. And he goes out, pulls out a service revolver, does Officer Joe Marshall Smith, and he sees a person there, and he says, "Stop," with his gun out. And this is the parking lot, right by the stockade fence area. And the person says, I'm with the Secret Service. And he shows ID. Everyone in the Secret Service was in the motorcade. So who was this person? Well, that's not what I'm getting at, though. I just wanted to throw that in for you. Here's the key. Here's the kicker. That's one of the individuals I was referring to who you see in the photo. Okay, now, JFK's, as a result of being hit from the front, and by the way, that's not someone standing on Elm Street filming right in front of the limo. It's geographically to the right because the limo hadn't passed. The limo had not yet passed that area of the stockade fence. And so the shot originated at the stockade fence. And it caused JFK's head to violently snap back and to the left, leaving him immobile, bodily depressed, and dead basically on his wife's right shoulder. Now, what I just read to you in substance makes it absurd in the extreme for our government. When you talk about the truth of our government, how in what God's name, if you are firing at someone from the back and you hit in the back of the head goes back. When has that ever happened since we've had a system of science that we have subscribed to?
It just defies
How
physics.
did that happen?
Yeah.
And you know what happened? The government was now involved in this thing. People were criticizing it left and right. People just didn't know what to believe anymore.
Yeah. Well, Robert, it's been such a pleasure to meet you. I really hope that people will purchase your book, That Day in Dallas. Lee Harvey Oswald Did Not Kill JFK. It's available now for pre-order. People can get it on Kindle. They can get it on hardcover. Will there be an audible version of the book if people want to listen to it?
Yes, absolutely. All my books, fortunately, have had audios. It's not something I do by my own choice. You know, there's so many things you want to get involved in it, but there are a lot of good people who do the reading, and they work with me, and they're very cooperative, but they want to do it right. They're professional, and I think they should have a career, frankly. It's not something I need to do in order to keep going alive with this one book kind of thing. But I appreciate very much, you know, the interest that you've shown, and I hope the audience has shown, because this is a great chance for us to reestablish what our justice system should be all about. And shame on all those people who think otherwise and use it as some personal toy to go after people, fellow citizens. Outrageous.
Absolutely. Well, thank you for joining me today. And I want to remind everybody they can sponsor Crowdsource the Truth by going to subscribestar.com or patreon.com/crowdsource the truth. You can go to crowdsourcethetruth.substack.com and, of course, on X at JG_CSTT. My guest, Robert Tanenbaum. Thank you so much. Have a great day, everybody. Have a great weekend, and thanks for watching.
God bless.